Today's episode, we interviewed Kathryn Shulz, a Pulitzer Prize winning author who just recently came out with a new book.
She sure did, Doc Nick. Lost and Found, where she talks about her dad's death and the love she finds somewhere in between.
Check it out.
Let's talk about death, baby. Let's talk about grief and mourning. Is it argumental or existential? What's it mean to me? Let's talk about death.
Hi, I'm Benny Cabal, and I'm a funeral professional.
And I'm Nicholas Cabal, a psychologist.
Hey, Nick, let's talk about death.
Let's do it.
Hey, Doc Nick, we have a really special guest with us today. Kathryn Shulz, a staff writer at The New Yorker, Pulitzer Prize winner. Congratulations on that. That is awesome. That is incredible.
Let's just take a moment of clap. Just a little golf clap.
Coming
Let's
in.
get it.
It's
Let's
coming
get
in.
it. That's, I mean,
Thank you very much.
They're going. That's perfect. She's been on TED Talks. She's got this new book, Lost and Found. The lost part, which is very, very significant to Doc Nick and I, is on losing your father. First and foremost, Kathryn, your dad's name.
My father's name was Isaac Shulz.
From Doc Nick and I, we want to give our condolences for your father, Isaac. That is quite a loss. And from what it looks like in your book, it was quite a monumental moment for you. Can you talk a little bit about that, how that all happened and where you were at that point?
Sure. My father died in 2016. And, as I say in the book, his death was actually not, I wouldn't call it a tragedy. It was incredibly sad. I was incredibly sad about it. But, he was 74 years old. He had lived a long and in many ways a truly remarkable life. So, and he died relatively peacefully and surrounded by people who loved him very much. So in many ways, it was probably about as close as you could get to what you would call a good death. And I think that's part of why it was so shocking to me, because it brought home to me the extent to which even a good death is incredibly devastating, and even when you're spared more difficult circumstances, a loss like that is really painful and really life altering and can take quite a lot of time to make your peace with.
It's interesting. You mentioned the idea of a traumatic death, right? And I think the one thing that I've at least experienced in my neck of the woods and dealing with clients who are suffering from loss is that doesn't necessarily have to be traumatic to be traumatic, if that makes sense. I think that society, we have this belief that if it wasn't traumatic, then you shouldn't be suffering from PTSD or and the reality is that moment of that experience of losing such a loved person in one's life can be traumatic in itself. So I just wanted to clarify that, because I think the thing is that just because it wasn't traumatic in the sense of a murder death or COVID death doesn't necessarily mean that it wasn't a traumatic death for you, because I think everybody's experience is so subjective, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. A lot of what I write about in the book is what I consider to be ordinary life. And I think in memoirs, contemporary memoirs in particular, there is often, for very good reasons, there's a lot of focus on the extreme, right? On kind of obvious trauma and drastic trauma. And I'm telling the story of the end of a long and good life. And I'm telling the story, the rest of the book is a love story, which is very precious to me, of course, but also completely normal. People fall in love every day, get married every day. And a lot of what I was interested in is the commonplace, the texture of ordinary life, because I think, to echo what you're saying, I think the thing about ordinary life is when it's happening to you, it's extraordinary. And even a death that, as you say, is not in societal terms traumatic can be terribly, terribly upsetting and disorienting to the person experiencing it. And that was certainly my experience. My father's death was the stuff of obituaries every day. And yet, obviously, to me, it was a devastating loss.
Well, and what I find first and foremost it's interesting that you do, and I think it's incredible that you mix love and grief together, because I think as much as there is death and grief are very traumatic, there also is a lot of love in grief. And I think the actually experiencing it and being able to meld these two concepts, which I think in our society, especially in America, is we don't want to talk about death, A. So thank you for that. And B, being able to mix it with love, and being able to express that the more you love, the more it hurts, right? And I just want to yet again thank you from the bottom of my heart, because Doc, Nick, and I are really just trying to get that we can talk about death, and there's a lot of good that comes from grief and death. It doesn't have to be all sadness and depression and anger. So thank you for that.
Of course. And, it's so interesting. My book is called Lost and Found, and it's in 3 parts. And the first section, Lost, tells the story of my father's death and my grief about it. And the second section, Found, tells the story of finding my partner and marrying her. But the last section of the book is called And, Lost and Found. The third section is called And it's about exactly what you're talking about, which is the absolute impossibility of separating our love from our grief. The deal with loving anyone, a parent, a partner, a child, is you have to accept the fact that love is the most beautiful and maybe the most precious thing in your life, but you don't have control over it, and it's not permanent. It will end the way everything ends. And conversely, grief can be so painful, but of course it's really a reflection of our love. We wouldn't grieve if we hadn't loved them very deeply. So I write quite a lot in the book about how impossible it is to separate those emotions from each other, and how beautiful it is in many ways that where we find one, we always find the other.
Well, I just want to take a moment to commend you in the vulnerability of sharing your story, allowing everybody to read it and to know something very personal to you. But I also think it's so important that we share these stories, because as you can probably guess from the podcast title, Let's Talk About Death, that's our big goal, is to educate people. And I think one of the best ways we can educate is through personal stories, right? And experiences. And again, even though grief is so different from person to person, that pain, that hurt, I think is kind of universal. When you truly love someone, it's going to hurt when you lose them. That's just the reality. And I think you sharing that and then mixing it in with love, I think is so important that, especially for people that are in the beginning cycle of grief, they get lost. They get lost in that grief, and they sometimes it's almost suffocating because they can't seem to grab onto anything else but focus on the grief. So to patch, I guess, both of those ideas together, the grief and the sadness and the hurt and the pain, with also this almost like a new beginning of love. And how do we somehow continue with our existence, this meaninglessness, painful existence that we have to find meaning and cope with the terror of death, but also try to make the best out of it.
Writing is interesting. I think it's obviously possible to write as an act of catharsis, to help yourself think through what's happened to you and ultimately to feel better about it. And I think that kind of writing is incredibly important. But because writing is what I do for a living, I do approach it a little bit differently. And in my case, by the time I sat down to write about my father's death, I would never want to say that I was, done grieving him. It's not like, grief is not a road that dead ends somewhere. You've reached the terminus and you turn left or turn right and you're not on it anymore. I think anyone who's ever grieved knows that it's quite cyclical and strange, and it can come back to you at unexpected moments, including long after you thought you'd kind of made your peace with the loss. But in terms of writing the book, I was writing about feelings I had already had and that I had thought about very deeply and felt very deeply. And in a way, it was quite wonderful and quite peaceful to revisit them from a different place, which was the place of how can I best share this with readers, including readers who might be facing their own losses or remembering their own losses. And what's the core idea here, or what's the language I can use here that will reach these people and maybe offer them a little bit of solace.
Yeah, there is no graduating grief. You don't just get to someday and you're like, well, graduated, I'm all done with that. Like, we don't have to, no, absolutely. You have those, they bring up always the stages of grief, the denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And nobody goes through them in that cyclical order, or they may go through them and they may start back, or they may start with one or whatnot. And yeah, absolutely. I 100% agree. But I want to go back into a couple other things. We're going to mostly talk about the book, but I did have a chance to watch your Theodore talk, or some people call TED Talk. And I really loved it. And one of the things you brought up in the TED Talk is the Wile E. Coyote falling off the cliff and dying, which is interesting. And then I was listening to another podcast you said you were dying to tell the story about the earthquake and what you got the Pulitzer. And I was thinking, that's so interesting how even in your outside perspective, death gets brought up.
Yeah, well, it's interesting. I mean, obviously, the language of death and the metaphors of death are all around us, and we use them all the time, including in ways that can feel shocking or painful if you are in the middle of grieving. We say, I'm dying, when something is really funny and cracking us up. And, that's all well and good until your, partner is actually dying of lung cancer or some such thing. And that kind of language can get painful. But it's interesting. I mean, in terms of that, the piece that I won the Pulitzer for is about a fault line off the Pacific Northwest that is the most dangerous fault line in the continental United States. And I was very aware of thinking about death and spent a lot of time talking about death, to borrow the name of your show, while I was reporting that, because we're very, very unprepared for the next earthquake and tsunami that fault line will unleash, and it will bring, unfortunately, a tremendous amount of death along with it. So it's certainly the case that, even prior to this book, some of my reporting has really brought me very deeply into the land of death, into thinking about death. Actually, the very first piece I ever wrote for the New Yorker, before I was even on staff there, was, curiously enough, a piece about the history of death certificates. So I think I actually spend kind of a lot of my professional life thinking about death now that you mention it.
Honestly, I think the more we talk about death, the more we can actually live. Daily dying is daily living, and reinventing ourselves through having these. And going back to the book, right? So you have this huge moment in your life, right? You're losing your father, and then you're finding the love of your life. What a duality at the time, right? What an interesting time to find your soulmate in this situation while you're going through this death. Can you go a little bit more into like that feeling?
It's interesting. I met my partner before my father died, and I married her after he died. So we got kind of the timing of it is such that we got sort of one of everything. We had one birthday and one Thanksgiving and one Hanukkah and one New Year's, and then it was over. My dad was gone, and that was the amount of time that the two of them overlapped in my life and on this planet. And on the one hand, I'm grateful every single day that they got to meet. I think it would be extremely painful to me to have lost my father before I met the person I was going to marry, because he does feel like such a central part of my life and so crucial to understanding who I am, that it was very meaningful to me that they met, and they also, as it happens, kind of adored and understood each other right away, and that was really precious to me. But yes, I mean, look, it's very, very interesting. I saw my family of origin kind of fracture with the loss of my father at the exact moment that I was making a family of my own. So it was really bittersweet. On the one hand, as I said, I'm glad they met. I did feel kind of sustained in the face of my grief by having this new love. It's very clear to me that if we had not yet met and I had been single when my father died, I don't want to say I wasn't devastated by his death. I was, but to be devastated is a state with a very elastic range, and there are degrees of it. And had I been single and had I not had her in my life, it's very clear to me I would have truly just become utterly unmoored and kind of fallen apart in the face of that death. And she really kept me together and helped me keep going, in part because I think that losing someone and falling in love are opposite experiences in many ways, but in one crucial way, when you fall in love with someone, a lot of what that experience is like is that you suddenly can picture the future. In fact, you can't stop picturing the future. It's so exciting. You have this new person, and in my case, from very early on, I knew I wanted to marry her, and it was really exciting. And we both wanted kids, and in fact, now have a kid. And so this whole kind of beautiful road just stretched open in front of me. And of course, when you lose someone, it's the exact opposite, right? The future that you had hoped for and anticipated just falls away. So it did. There's no question that the experiences echoed each other in really uncanny ways, and also that her love, as I said, really did help serve as a kind of fortress against some of the more truly undoing aspects of grief. But the truth is, I think all of us, even if I hadn't been falling in love at the same time and making a family of my own at the same time, grief, and I write about this quite a lot in the book, grief, like pretty much all human experiences, is itself really mixed. I was shocked, and as a funeral director, this will not shock you at all. But my father's memorial service was, I suppose, what you might expect a memorial service to be. It was beautiful and moving, and had a few light moments, but it was somber in tone, and people there were wonderful, but very sad to have lost them. And after that service was over, it was a beautiful autumn night, and all of us, the family and about 1 billion friends, my father was a very beloved person in his community, went and had a kind of picnic on the just on the like in the backyard of some family friends. And I would never in a million years have believed this if you had told me so beforehand, but I am telling you, it was one of the greatest parties I've ever been to. Even when you're not falling in love at the same time, there is surprisingly, elements of joy in grief, and elements of laughter in sorrow, and elements of happiness, even in these kind of long, bleak, difficult days. So yeah, it's, as I said, part of what my book is about is the profound mixedness of human emotion and human experience.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring up the idea of the after, right? Whether we call it, just to get together, a picnic, I think is your term, or just everybody getting together and sharing stories. And I think one of the things that we've realized, at least in my experience, and hopefully in Ben's too, is this importance of community, especially when we lose someone that we love. I think that unfortunately our society is moving more towards individualistic versus a community based, which I think COVID has really shined a light on, especially with the idea that people can't gather and can't share stories and can't share hugs. I don't know. Of course, for some people, hugs may be too much. It may be traumatic for some people. But I also think for a lot of people, that human touch is such an important factor in just knowing that you're not alone. And I think one of the things that when I was just listening to how you were talking about that picnic, I think grief in itself is so isolating. It's so lonely, especially because we all go through it differently. We may be going through it in a way, you know, alone, because our grief is so different than everybody else's. So to have a place where we can come, share, laugh, cry, hug, shake hands, I think it's so important. So thank you for sharing that story, because I think it's important for people to hear this, especially for people that lost someone to COVID and maybe this is their first experience with a funeral. Um, it's so important to think about others, because maybe you don't need a service. Maybe you don't feel the necessity for it, but there may be someone in your family that needs that.
I mean, a really strange feature of this pandemic is it has made us grateful for things we never kind of paused to be grateful for before. Whoever thought we'd be grateful to, I'm grateful for my friends. I love them, but I never stopped to be grateful for, like, I can hang out with my friends, right? That seemed like a given of life, and not the kind of thing that could get taken away. And Likewise, I could never have imagined when my father was dying circumstances that would have prevented me from being in the hospital with him, or having a service for him and a celebration afterward. And I really do feel fortunate that I got to be with him. And it breaks my heart, all the people who did not get to sit with their loved ones while they were dying, which I think is such a fundamentally important part of being human. And to your point, I think it's already eroded some in our society. I don't think we sit with the dying and the sick as much as we should and as much as we used to. And it's hard and it's sad, but it's also a great honor. And the time I spent at my father's side when he was dying is very precious to me. I would, believe me, rather have spent another 20 years at his side when he was living, but it was incredibly meaningful to be there when he was dying. And I really, I can't imagine being deprived of that. And I think it must make both grieving and emerging from grief much harder for the people who lost someone during a pandemic.
Oh, absolutely. And going to your honor of being able to sit bedside by your father, Doc Nick and I had the opportunity to watch our grandfather in his last couple days. We actually got to watch him take his last final breaths and be there and hear our grandmother whisper, "It's okay to go." It was an interesting experience, but I wouldn't change it for the world. I think it made me a better professional, and it made me completely understand some of that the families come in with. And so, you know what, if we could go into that, Kathryn, a little bit. You mentioned in a little bit about the hospice side, and your dad was ill. If you don't mind, can you go into that a little bit, that experience?
Yeah, I would be happy to. I actually have strong feelings about it. So my father was sick for a long time before he died, but not in a very straightforward way. You know, he didn't have cancer or Parkinson's or frankly any clear-cut diagnosis. He had a lot of the kind of problems that are just sort of standard issue old age problems in this country. You know, he had cardiac issues and he had high blood pressure. Um, but he also had a fairly mysterious autoimmune disorder that literally the finest doctors at the Cleveland Clinic could never quite figure out what was going on with him. And it made his health quite unstable, and caused a whole array of sort of unrelated and unpredictable problems. All of which meant that when he went into the hospital for what turned out to be the final time, there was no real knowing it was the final time. There was no real knowing, you know, they could tell us kind of piece by piece what was going wrong. Oh, you know, for some reason his white blood cell count is high, or for some reason he's tachycardic, or, you know, this kind of thing. But they couldn't say, or they didn't say, you know, your father has X situation, X condition, X disease. This is what we're seeing. Um, and one difficulty with that is I think it exacerbated a tendency which is pretty pronounced in a lot of modern American hospitals anyway, which is to do anything possible to treat every possible symptom or condition, even as it becomes increasingly apparent that the cost of doing so is very, very high, and that the odds of the person A, surviving, and B, having a life that's worth living after all of these interventions just is plummeting and plummeting and plummeting. And the truth is, you know, my father was, I think, probably well past the place where that should have been obvious to any medical professional. And no medical professional said it to us. You know, they told us all kinds of things and they suggested all kinds of tests and they identified all kinds of emergent problems. But no one who was actually on my father's care team sat us down and said, listen, this is very, very difficult, but the man you love is dying. Uh, the people who finally did that, first of all, my mother and my sister, who are amazingly clear-sighted and very, very brave, just emotionally brave people, just kind of knew. They were way ahead of me on that. I was not sort of, they led me there and that was fine, but I wouldn't have gotten there by myself. I wasn't denying it, you know, I wasn't resistant to it, but I wasn't prepared to just kind of stake that claim myself. But they were quite worried that that was what was happening. And finally, a very good friend of his who is a doctor but was not his doctor came to visit us in the hospital as he had done every day. And we just said, you know, what would you do? And he said, if he were my family member, I would tell him I loved him and I would let him go. And I cannot begin to express to you what a gift it was to us. And I honor doctors everywhere, and they do amazing work, including doctors that kept my father alive for a very long time. But I will say, I wish, they too need to talk about death, and they need to do it
Oh,
more,
yeah.
and they need to do it more honestly, um, because it is a gift. I get why it's hard. Of course, it's hard. I wasn't good at it either, but I think it is a real gift to families to be honest when it's clear what's happening, and it was clear what was happening. And the flip side of that is, I must say, the hospice team was just tremendous. They were wonderful and kind and gentle, and very caring, both of my father in his final days and of all of us, his family members. So, it's very tough, obviously, to just accept that someone you love is not going to make it. They're not going to come from home from the hospital at that time. And yet, on balance, I think it's much better and a more authentic and beautiful experience, and a better way to honor someone we love, to accept the truth when it's there in front of us. And that's not to say that we should never take heroic measures. There's situations where they work, right, and where it's important. But in a clear-cut case where someone is dying, I think we owe each other the courtesy of acknowledging it.
Yeah, no, and I think you mentioned something, we've talked about a lot on the podcast, and that's living versus existing, right? Is that a real having your loved one actually live, or having them basically live for you? You know what I
Hmm.
mean? I think a lot of doctors don't want to admit that they can't go any further. You know what I mean?
Hmm.
So they're going to try to bring anything they can to because they take pride in their work, and but I think at some time you just got to be honest and be that, you know what, it's time. And good for your sister and your mom for kind of getting you there, because it makes sense. We think we're ready for these kind of situations, but nobody's ever prepared.
My thought is this. I do want to, I do want to give this thought out to what you were talking about, because I think working in the death field in general is a very tough field. We, of course, are being conflicted all the time with our own demise, right? Every day is a reminder that one day it's going to be me, right? And I think we as human beings and how our society works with death, we avoid talking about it, but I think we also try desperately everything we can do to live. And I think, again, in the medical field, I think that is their focus, right? Their focus is to keep us alive. And I think that I think about the show House. If anybody's watched the show House, that doctor can be kind of a jerk, but if you watch that show, you're like, I wish he would be my doctor, because he's going to do the crazy stuff to keep me alive, right? He's going to do everything he can to make sure that that happens. But I think the one thing that gets lost, and I think you nailed it, is this idea that there comes a point where we just got to let him go. We just got we just got to come to terms that death is going to happen, and it's here. And unfortunately, for anybody who's grieving that person, it sucks. It's not easy. But I think it's a lot harder to see them in so much pain, in so much suffering. And I think that's where I do want to, again, tip my hat to hospice workers, because they probably, just like a funeral director or a um, psychologist who specializes in grief and loss, we get attached to these people, these families. It's almost like there is a part of us that we leave behind with each and every family that we deal with and work with. And that takes a toll, because the reality is that, again, we are human beings too, and we have to live with this idea that today I'm going in and I'm going to help another person die.
Going back into Lost and Found, Kathryn, can you bring up maybe some things that kind of caught you off guard when you were writing these pieces? When you were writing it, did you find that there was a part that maybe you thought was going to be easier and it was a lot more difficult when it came to your talking about death and grieving? Can you go into that a little bit?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did find parts of this book hard to write, but it did not correlate very neatly to what's emotionally difficult. Meaning, there are things that are emotionally painful, and then, as a writer, there are things that are difficult, that often don't have to do with the emotional experience, if that makes sense. As it happens, of the three parts of this book, I did find Lost hardest to write. And you might imagine that would be because it was about death and required me to revisit in real clarity and real detail the experience of losing my father. But for the most part, that was not what was difficult. Actually, it was difficult because it was the beginning of the book, and beginnings are very hard as a writer, or at least for this writer. And there were certain things about it that made it structurally difficult to write. But I almost had the opposite experience, meaning that there was real joy for me in the fact that I got to. I don't want to say bring my father back to life, because that's a quite glib expression. I mean, tragically, the one thing we can do is never actually bring back to life the people we've lost. But I did get to spend a lot of time with him in my mind and in my memory. And probably the most gratifying thing so far about the book, it's again very young, it's 2 days old, but it's lovely to hear from people whose reaction to the book is in part, gosh, your father seemed amazing. By the time he died, I missed him too. And to me, that's whatever else happens with the book, that makes it worth writing it. It was very sweet to me to be able to introduce my dad, and also my partner, actually, to a lot of people who would not otherwise get to know either of them. They're remarkable people, and it felt like I hope a gift to them, but certainly a gift to me.
When you were going through the basically the stages of your dad dying, and then also finding the love of your life at the same time, almost, um, did you have any like guilt?
It's a great question, and I'm glad you asked it, because I can imagine that there are listeners who have had that experience where everyone around you is experiencing a kind of relentless grief, but your own grief is punctuated or leavened by this really wonderful experience. So I think that's emotionally astute, and as I said, I'm sure it happens to a lot of people. Um, that was not the case for me, in part because primarily I was grieving my father with my mother and my sister. My sister is also happily partnered and has a family, and has for quite some time. So it's not like, she was alone and lonely and I had this like shiny new love. So I had an anchor. She also had an anchor, several, in fact, because she does have children. I think for my mom, she was very happy for me, that I was not going through it alone. I'm sure she would have worried a lot about me. I know she worried about me in general. I think, and about my sister too. I think even when your children are fully grown, I am mindful that it was very sad for my mom to watch my sister and me mourn. You obviously want to protect your children from grief, and of course you can't when your husband dies, their father. And I know that was hard for her. And although we begged and pleaded with her not to do it, I know she did try to protect us from some of her grief, not to an extreme, and she let us in many ways. But of course, as a parent, you don't want to expose them to the kind of rawness of your grief. I never felt guilty about being in love. It's hard to imagine feeling guilty about being in love. It's um, such a wonderful state, and a state I feel so fortunate about and grateful for every day. So I don't have any guilt around that. It was less that the love kind of leavened the grief than that the grief darkened the love. I was mindful that, here's my poor partner. She meets me. One of the things we have in common is we both come from very happy families and loving families to whom family matters a lot. Uh, and we haven't known each other all together that long, when, like, lo and behold, there we are in a hospital together. And, I was mindful, like, oh my gosh, I've like dragged this person into this kind of endless sick room at the hospital, and then of course dragged her into grief with me. Her parents are both still alive and very wonderful, and I don't think I was like the worst partner in the world while I was grieving my father most acutely, but no one's their best self when they're grieving. And
Right.
um, yeah, I mean, no one's at their most fun after they've lost their father. So I was mindful of that piece of it.
A lot of people talk about leaving a legacy, right? And talking about the person's legacy. What a great way to memorialize your father through your book. People got to meet your father through this book. What a beautiful way to not only, memorialize your father, but almost like open the world to the love of your life too.
Mm.
So Kudos to you doing both. That's tough to do in one book.
Yeah, it's almost you almost have like an ongoing eulogy going out to the
Mm.
world on your father. And I think that's impressive, right? This epitaph, this book that will continue he'll live on through this book, through you, which is incredible. And it's awesome. And going back to your piece on your partner kind of dealing through kind of a quick death in your relationship, I myself, I married my high school sweetheart,
Oh,
and 3 months into our relationship, her father committed suicide. And
oh gosh.
I think in some ways our relationship got stronger quicker because of that. Because I know she was I got to see her true self at a very early time, not only in her age but also in our relationship. And I think if you can go through that and you still love the person, I think you're doing okay. You know what I mean? In that situation, like you're saying, like, here, meet my dad. Oh, now we're going through this step, right?
There are these moments in life when you really see who someone is, and you see how you operate together in situations of extremity, emotional or otherwise. And yes, there's no question that our relationship deepened faster than it otherwise would have. I mean, it felt almost from the beginning very deep and very connected, and in part because we actually do both. Uh, Quite aside from the death of my father, we both care about these kind of existential questions. They're things we think
No,
about a lot. Not by accident. Had she worked as a hospital chaplain, you have to really be thinking about life and death and the meaning of both of them to do that work and do it well. But so it already felt deep, but of course it is very different to kind of walk side by side with someone through an experience like that. And you're totally right. Um, I'm confident we would have gotten there anyway, but I do think it accelerated certain parts of our closeness.
One last question I had for you. You mentioned this idea of the euphemisms around death and dying. The passed away, or they're in a better place, or And one of the things I thought about, because we've talked about this on the show, this idea of what not to say to people that are grieving, because I think unfortunately it's a knee jerk reaction, right? They're uncomfortable, so I'm thinking about you, or I'm here if you need anything, right?
yeah,
Or
call me if you need me for anything. Yeah,
and I think I would love to hear your, because you got stuck on the word lost, right? That was the word that really resonated. Yeah, there we go. Resonated
Sure
with
did.
you. Can you speak more to that?
Sure. Yeah, it's actually how the book opens. Yes, I really have just always disliked the kind of pat things people say in the face of death. This kind of, you know, this language of, oh, he's in a better place, or, oh, I'm so, you know, he passed on, or it's never worked for me. And I don't want to be dismissive because that language exists. I think in part to give people something to say in moments when it's very hard to know what to say. And I'm sympathetic to how difficult that is. And I also think that language is meaningful to some people. I think there's some people for whom the idea of, gone home or gone to a better place is actually their rock, and their reassurance. And it's how they get through grief. But I am not one of those people. And I did not find any of it comforting. But yes, in all that kind of set of ways to talk about death that don't involve saying the word death, there was one that did feel meaningful to me, and it was that word lost. You lost your father, which right away actually felt emotionally accurate to me. When you're lost, you are scared, you are isolated, you are profoundly disoriented, you don't know where you are and you don't know where you're going. And I thought, well, that actually is what grief is like. That doesn't even seem like
Yeah.
a
Oh,
euphemism. That
yeah.
seems actually accurate. So yes, from the beginning, this idea of lostness was really interesting to me, and a lot of the project of the first part of this book is not just to tell the story of grief and think about grief, but to think about this larger category of loss, and then the whole range of things we lose, and what, if anything, they have in common. And I do think our losses have a lot in common.
It's interesting because, and we talked about this, the idea of everybody grieves differently and everybody has a subjective experience. I've heard from a lot of people the opposite when it comes to the word loss. Like, I didn't lose them, they died. And it's interesting because I also think it's all about timing too when they say these words, because again, everybody goes through it differently. Maybe you hit the person at an anger part of their process, and no matter what you say, it's not going to resonate. So maybe this might be a good education moment. Maybe the more important thing is just being present and don't worry about what to say. Maybe not saying something is actually the best way to go, and just be there. And again, I was touching on the idea of touch, this idea of just this presence, and how much or for how important for a lot of people is this presence, this community, and that I'm not alone. And then it's, even though it sucks that I have to wake up every day without X, whoever the person was, I still have people in my life to share joy. I still have people in my life that do want to listen to me rant about all the feelings I'm having right now. And I think that's so important. And to really, and not just being there, but listening. So yeah, no, it just, when the word loss resonating with you, I was just interested in your story.
Sure. I'm sympathetic to people for whom it's not the right word, because again, for me, most words were not the right word, including ones that I know are very comforting to other people. And I also think you're right that what is and is not the right word really varies from moment to moment, from death to death. I mean, I can tell you right now, I lost someone earlier in my life to violence. And actually, I don't think the word lost would have felt as applicable to that, because it seemed as if that person had been really actively taken away, which is very different than someone dying peacefully in old age. So I absolutely think that you can't, there's not a one size fits all for any of it, not for language, not for touch, not for how they're going to move through grief, not for how to move through it with them. But I certainly think you're right that on some level, the details don't matter. The words don't matter. Plenty of people who use words I would not use were sources of great comfort to me after my father died, because they are loving and stalwart and checked in on me and told me they were thinking about my father and said his name. And there's any number of ways to be present for someone. And I would never hold against someone else, the wrong word choice here or there. And I hope we all would extend that courtesy to people, because we're not mind readers. We don't know what someone needs, but we can certainly count on the fact that they need love and steadfast presence, and sometimes frankly just a meal, or
Yeah, absolutely.
someone to do the pragmatics for them. Yeah.
Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and talking to these dweebs about death, because it is so important to do that. And we are always up for an existential conversation, Kathryn. So if you need some other walls to bounce ideas off of, you know where to find us. So your book's out. You can find it everywhere, right? I would assume it's anywhere and everywhere.
It's anywhere
Is
and
there any?
everywhere.
Go get it. Lost and Found, Kathryn Shulz. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be amazing. You're going to love it. It's going to change your world. And it's about death. So yeah, go out and read it. Give it a good read.
For a person with ADHD, is it on audiobooks yet?
It is on audiobook, and I myself read it. So if you
Ooh,
hated my voice
double
this
win.
last hour, don't go listen to it. But if you enjoyed this podcast, then yes, you could hear me read my own book.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
Yet again, Kathryn, you've been amazing. Thank you so much for sharing and really getting into your life experience.
Well, thanks so much for having me on the show.
Thank you. And if you haven't, please like us, review us, send us any of your questions. We really appreciate it out there. And Doc Nick, if you're not talking about death,
you aren't living.
Thank you. Have a great night.